Good afternoon, good evening for some, perhaps good morning. My name is Xymena Kurowska. I work as Associate Professor of International Relations at Central European University in Vienna, and I welcome you all today to our CIVICA event entitled Europe and the New Global Challenges. We started organizing this event a few months ago, and we started organizing it as a reflection on international security, democratic backsliding, and authoritarianism in conditions that some in security studies call unpeace, after Lucas Keller. Very few might have imagined that we would be meeting when the logic of war has taken over. It has not been very easy for us, as many of us have been in shock, to try to think how to reframe the event. We have decided to give space and make space for a large conversation. And as the Putin's government is pursuing its attempt to overturn the European and perhaps global security architecture in disregard of human life and with brutal force, for many, the 24th of February 2022 marks before and after in their lives, in their careers. And so it has become for many of us, students of European security, European integration, and Russian foreign policy, as myself. We are still in the situation of privilege today, all of us, I think certainly those that have organized this event. We are in the privilege of being able to still speak relatively freely without bombing, without witnessing bombing and bombs falling on our heads, and without being terrified by the zombifying propaganda and eradication of the freedom of speech. That also means that this privilege makes us responsible for revisiting a number of different conversations. The two thematic groups of CIVICA that co-sponsored the event today, Europe Revisited, that I have led, and Democracy in 21st Century that Zsolt Enyedi has been leading, indeed have quite a lot of work moving forward, as does the whole alliance of CIVICA. And we would like to start these conversations today. Before I open to our keynotes and to our roundtable, I would like us all to observe a minute of silence in respect for those that have perished in the war of aggression waged against the sovereign nation of Ukraine. Thank you. I would now like to pass on the floor for the welcome remarks to Professor Dr. Cornelia Woll. Cornelia is, as of today, the new president of the Hertie School in Berlin, the host institution of this conference. This is actually Cornelia's first public appearance in her new role, and it is no coincidence it is for a CIVICA event. Cornelia is deeply familiar with the alliance as she joins the Hertie School from another CIVICA member university, Sciences Po in Paris. At Sciences Po, Cornelia served as a political science professor and researcher, co-director of the Max Blanc Sciences Po Center, and member of the advisory board. Cornelia, on behalf of CIVICA, best wishes to you as you begin your Hertie School presidency. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Xymena, for this kind introduction. Dear speakers, dear members of the CIVICA Alliance, dear friends across Europe and across the globe. Today's topic is Europe and the new global challenges, and sadly, the topic could not be more timely. As Xymena has reminded us, when we agreed on this topic, few would have imagined the circumstances we see today. As we speak, a war is raging less than 1,000 kilometers from Berlin, a war that was unleashed by the Russian government's invasion of Ukraine. Some of our audience today is even closer to the conflict zone. Some are farther away, but we all feel the ripple effect of this war. And while we anxiously follow the news to find out the latest developments and find ways to help, today is an opportunity to reflect and also look at the bigger picture. How can universities, and in particular European social scientists, provide insights and answers in an acute crisis while also taking into account the broader context? What is the long-term impact of current developments? What role does academia play in a crisis of this scale that seems far beyond all of our competences? How can we collaborate across different levels of society to make Europe more resilient to current and future threats? Our European university is uniquely positioned to answer some of these questions. CIVICA brings together expertise from top-notch researchers in key fields relevant for these trying times, from international security to energy policy to the study of authoritarianism and the mechanisms of European integration. At the same time, we believe that research can provide actionable policy advice and inform debates within society. We will hear from an esteemed group of colleagues later today. As Xymena mentioned, today is my first day as president of the Hertie School. And even in these trying times, it is a pleasure and an honor that my first official engagement in this new role is to open the CIVICA Conference of 2022. Our alliance brings together leading social science universities in Europe. For the Hertie School, this partnership within CIVICA and the European universities more broadly is of crucial importance. We are proud of the close ties in teaching, research, and outreach that we have been able to foster over the past 3 years, and that we will further deepen in the years to come. I would now like to pass the floor to Kate Vivian, who is Acting Vice President for International Affairs at Sciences Po in Paris, one of my past close colleagues, and the Alliance Coordinator on the CIVICA Steering Committee. Thank you, Kate, for all your hard work, especially as we discuss and plan how to take CIVICA forward in the coming years. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Cornelia. Merci beaucoup. And thank you so much to the Hertie School for today's event. It's really an honor and a delight to have the opportunity today to say a few very quick words on behalf of the CIVICA Alliance. Indeed, as you mentioned, Cornelia and Xymena, this conference comes in a very timely, albeit terrifying manner. In the midst of such truly dark days, we do feel strongly that universities, in particular in Europe today, have such a critical role to play on a number of levels, from continuing to provide safe and inclusive environments to all in defense of the values of autonomy and academic freedom, providing expert fact-based analysis, which contributes to a better understanding of what we're currently facing and what's unfolding, as well as very concretely, and this is also where CIVICA is going to be playing a role, offering safe haven to those who are directly or indirectly impacted by the war, be they students, faculty, staff who are in exile or who will be in exile soon. Our ambition within CIVICA, Cornelia, you mentioned it, is truly, amongst other goals, to join our forces on many levels, in particular in times of crisis, as individual institutions in a unique and meaningful manner, as we defend and promote our common European values shared with the Ukrainian people today. The past 3 years have, of course, been very rich for CIVICA in terms of activities and in striving for these goals. And concretely for today, CIVICA unites over 50,000 students across the continent, 10,000 academic staff from 8 world-class institutions, soon to be 10. And the first phase of this project has really highlighted the significant commitment of each individual institution to working collaboratively towards building a broad European inter-university campus that links us on so many levels: teaching and learning, research and innovation, civil society across linguistic and cultural borders, national borders, of course, as well. And really to meet those goals, an ambitious array of activities has so far been implemented. They've really been designed to benefit all communities within our institutions, all students, academic and non-academic staff, as well as, of course, the broader public, such as today, under the umbrella of the 4 interdisciplinary themes that we identified initially for the first phase of CIVICA, and of which you mentioned, Xymena, today 2 are particularly close to the discussion. We do believe that within CIVICA, we've been able to begin generating concrete solutions to European and world challenges, and particularly in times of crisis such as today. I will mention that we're mobilizing currently within CIVICA to see how we can adapt our next phase, or emergency actions and the next phase, to being able to support those who have been impacted by the crisis in this time of responsibility that is our shared responsibility. So we've been working through coordinated strategic planning, innovative governance, integrated activities, virtual and physical mobility across the board, flexible curricula, joint courses, open courses, and a truly networked approach to preparing students for careers, civic engagement, and societal outreach across the Alliance. More specifically within CIVICA research, and I'm nearly finished there, is that we've been working on ways in which we can endow our Alliance with instruments for a truly ambitious collaborative research strategy, creating a long-term environment for members of our faculty across CIVICA, and exploring joint research infrastructures in that space. And the first year of CIVICA, only the first year of CIVICA research, has been extremely successful, supporting 11 collaborative research projects so far, a postdoctoral mobility scheme, a doctoral conference, snowball seminars, 4 hackathons, the first of 4 hackathons, sorry, and an open access roundtable were held in this short year. So we really see how the Alliance is providing a space to develop a number of activities that we've deemed to be quite innovative, and we hope are providing interesting input across the Alliance and more broadly. So through all of these commitments and action, truly, we do hope that CIVICA is contributing to the goal of strengthening the European higher education space, European identity, and we very much look forward to pursuing these ambitions during the next phase, taking us through until 2026 in solidarity with all those who share the same values as us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Kate. It is a great pleasure now for me to introduce our first keynote speaker, Manon Blanc from European External Action Service. And when again we were planning this event some months ago, I thought it's a great idea to talk about UNPEACE. And now we are opening our substantive part with someone who is in the midst of grappling with the practice of kind of sliding into the logic of war. Let me introduce Manon. Manon Leblanc is head of international cyber policy at the European External Action Service. Prior to this posting, Manon served to the 2016 Netherlands presidency of the Council of the European Union, and she was a senior advisor to the Secretary General at the Ministry of Justice and Security in The Hague. Manon, it's an honor and pleasure to have your company and the opportunity to listen to your reflection. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Xymena, for having me today here in these indeed challenging times. And our thoughts and solidarity are with Ukraine and its people, obviously. Today, I would like to elaborate a bit on the thinking on the developments in cyberspace, online, and what are the considerations that we are looking at, both when it comes to our personal engagement as well as to international security matters. So Marshall McLuhan became famous in the 1960s for saying that we live in a global village. And in the age of television, this meant that events around the world, such as back then the Vietnam War, would reach everyone's living room. However, with the knowledge of today, this metaphor seemed to be incomplete, because in his living room, one could observe what was going on elsewhere, but he himself remained an anonymous observer. There was no village yet. The internet and technologies have changed all of this, and now we really do live in a global village, with villagers still trying to remain anonymous for various, but sometimes also less noble reasons, but with interaction through this network of networks. Search engines bring you anywhere, and different apps offer solutions for any possible life situation just in our smartphones. And the immense use of data transfers has the possibility to turn a person into an open book, just like in a small village a century ago. And with the war of which we are now part, even only online at this stage, it really has become this one global village. At the same time, we see that international conflict also has changed due to these technologies, receiving the additional layer of rapid disinformation possibilities and new vulnerabilities that can affect a whole society at once. International relations really do mirror the challenges of the physical world, and we see that geopolitical tensions are leading to security threats, fragmentation, but also are paralyzing effective multilateralism, which is the core to international security. Cyberspace is increasingly misused to conduct cyber attacks for political, financial, but also economic gain, which is in the long term very harmful to the EU and its member states. Regardless of the possibilities and the challenges that the technologies bring, we have to stay vigilant and not abandon fundamental values on which modern civilized life is based in a liberal democracy, such as human rights, rule of law, free and fair elections. And these are the fruits of a non-technological revolutions in the West over the past 300, 400 years. So the possible implications of the use of technologies for our society, our privacy, human rights, our economy, democracy, security, they're staggering, something that we really have to keep an eye on. And also because the rules of personal engagement with the online world are actually defined while the technology develops, and we are just beginning to address the question on how to reflect a liberal democracy in the digital age, and continue how to discuss how international law actually applies in cyberspace. And when we continue to develop these technologies, we should acknowledge that in the end, people and their habits and their behavior are still key to the use of the ICT. It's not the computer itself that conducts the cyber attack. There's also a fine line that we need to see between where do we protect personal privacy and how do we ensure national security without fluctuating from one extreme to the other. We should look at how to counter disinformation without harming human rights and fundamental freedoms, notably the freedom of speech. We should see how we can ensure people can make informed choices online, managing the use of algorithms and artificial intelligence. How can we ensure the transformation where there's no one left behind? Or how can we promote, but also foremost enforce responsible state behavior in cyberspace? All questions that we are trying to address and which are not easy and which take time. Unfortunately, there's no quick fixes here. Certainly not as the internet is global and open, and we have to at times cooperate with 193 countries to set some of these norms and standards. And if something has become clear even more recently with the recent and unacceptable Russian aggression against Ukraine, this is not an easy debate. It's no exaggeration to say that who sets the rules will rule the world. And it's so vital important that the norms and standards continue to reflect universal values. The network of networks with decentralized government that the internet is under pressure by authoritarian vision of government control. And some states are increasingly showing disdain for international law and norms of responsible state behavior in cyberspace, as well as human rights and fundamental freedoms online. And we see this happening every day, certainly now within the war in Ukraine. And these efforts to control cyberspace oppose our vision that cyberspace and the internet, they're global, open, and governed by all stakeholders, respectful of human rights and fundamental freedoms, and to support social, economic, and political development. Unfortunately, we live in a permanent battle of narrative about the issues that determine our future, and we face major ideological challenges today. 30 years after the end of the Cold War, we are facing a determined effort to redefine core tenets of the multilateral order. The outcome will define whether the post-war multilateral acquis survives, centered on the United Nations, international law, and universal rights, or whether this will be replaced by a power-based multilateral order with zones of influence and a relatives approach to human rights. And this is happening offline and online. And we are therefore also with your support strengthening our policies and adopting them to the digital realm, looking at our disarmament policies, our deterrence policies, our development policies, all to counter the manifesto by some authoritarian states to review the world order as they seek to undermine the notion of individual rights, making them subject to local and culturally determined limitations. We therefore continue the implementation of our cyber diplomacy policy, contributing to conflict prevention and greater stability in international relations, and look forward to, together also with you and all your colleagues, ensure a global, open, stable, and secure cyberspace. It is up to us, and certainly within the context of multi-stakeholder cooperation, to continue to find the appropriate answers of what a liberal democracy means in the digital age, and how to ensure that international security and stability in cyberspace is achieved through diplomatic means. Thank you very much for this cooperation, and thank you for having me here today.
Manon, thank you so much for recentering us and our discussion, and reminding us that even if we might be sliding into the logic of war, we have a lot of responsibility and a lot of work to do. Again, thank you very much. I would like to bring in now our second keynote speaker, Simon Hicks, a renowned professor of European integration, EU politics, known to many of us as students of European politics. Simon, until not long ago, was part of London School of Economics faculty, but he has now moved to another member of our CIVICA Alliance, European University Institute, where he now holds the Stein Rokkan Chair in Comparative Politics. So with lovely Florence, which I remember with much nostalgia, as having done my PhD there, Simon Hicks, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Xymena. Greetings to everybody from Firenze. It's a great pleasure to speak at a CIVICA event. I had a small role in my position at LSE in helping to build the CIVICA Alliance. It's great to see it developing. I realize I've not got long to speak, so I'll move on quickly. What I'm going to talk about is I'm going to try to address the question, will the new challenges lead to a major step forward in European integration? Of course, it's far too early to tell, but how would I start to think about that question as a political scientist of democratic institutions? I've been rereading William Riker's classic 1964 book, Federalism, Origin, Operation, and Significance. And I'll say a little bit about Riker's ideas, then I'll say a few things about recent crises and the EU's responses, and why I think this crisis is qualitatively fundamentally different. So Riker, in his classic book, Federalism, proposed two necessary, although not sufficient conditions for what he called a federal bargain. First, politicians who offer the bargain desire to expand their territorial control, usually either to meet an external military or diplomatic threat, or to prepare for military or diplomatic aggression or aggrandizement. Secondly, the politicians who accept the bargain, giving up some independence for the sake of union, are willing to do so because of some external military diplomatic threat. So of course you can see how relevant what he was writing about back in 1964 is for the current situation in Europe. His focus was on external existential military security threat, as he put it. He even wrote in the mid-1990s about the process of European integration. In 1996, he was addressing the question of whether or not he thought trade would be sufficient and common interest. He said it's unclear whether the motive of trade restriction is sufficient to replace the military motive in creating a European federation. He was skeptical it was. He still believed that fundamentally unions of states are only willing to form what he called a federal bargain when they face this existential threat. And what's interesting, if you look back at recent crises, the EU is no stranger to crisis. And I always like to say to my students that never underestimate the ability of the EU to find a way to muddle through in a crisis. And I think what is interesting, if you look back, is every time the EU has faced a threat, people have said this is the end of the EU. I mean, if we go back even to the late 70s and early 80s, Europe was lagging behind East Asia and North America after the 1970s oil crisis. This led to the Single European Act and the push for the single market and eventually the euro. If we think about the sovereign debt crisis in Europe between 2010 and 2013, among other things, that crisis led to the European Stability Mechanism, new rules for balancing national budgets, and a plan for banking union. And if we think about the refugee crisis, the EU was unable to agree a burden-sharing scheme for refugees, which I'll return to in a bit. But the refugee crisis did lead to much stronger external border force, much more coordination of European policies on refugees. And then we think about the pandemic recently. This pushed the EU to common vaccine purchasing, which was unpopular in some parts of Europe at the beginning and perceived as a failure. But if you look back, you can see this as a massive success for the EU. And also, of course, the EU recovery plan of 800 billion euros, so a massive recovery plan. So each of these crises, in other words, has led to new steps towards European integration in particular policy areas. However, internal divisions have limited larger steps or spillovers from each of these particular policy areas to more broadly the process of European integration or fundamentally changing the institutional design of the EU. And of course, I think this is partly because none of these crises were really an existential threat for the EU. The EU was able to act quite slowly, quite deliberatively, and muddle through. When we think about the current crisis, of course, this is now qualitatively fundamentally different. Russia's invasion of the Ukraine is an existential threat to the European integration project. His threat is not just to Ukraine. His threat is to several member states of the EU in Eastern and Central Europe, the Baltic states, Poland, Romania, Slovakia, and so on. The former parts of Europe that Putin sees as should be within the Russian sphere of influence. This is a direct challenge to the European integration project, in addition to, of course, being a direct challenge to the West. What has been impressive, of course, has been the EU's unity of response and unity of preference and unity of purpose. So we have massive sanctions to Russia that I think we could never have imagined, that within the first couple of days we thought was never possible to agree. And of course, now the EU very quickly moved towards this and even brought Hungary and Poland on board. There's been agreement on provision of arms to Ukraine. There's been agreement on a massive increase in defense spending. And there, I think the big shift in Germany was a fundamental shift for the European project. And there's even discussion, of course, now, although at early days, of a European army. And I think there will be more push towards a serious discussion about European military and EU military capacity. And we can see even the member states themselves moving towards unanimous views about linking the EU to the defense and military arena. Denmark is discussing ending its opt-out on defense cooperation, and the 4 EU member states that are not members of NATO, I think, are already discussing and will discuss and decide quite quickly, I think, to probably join NATO or at least join some new arrangement or architecture that allows them to be associate members and more actively involved in defense decision-making. So in the medium term, I think we will see a big shift forward in policy terms as a result of this crisis towards common defense policies, towards common refugee policy. And here I think it will be interesting when Poland and Eastern Central European countries come to the rest of Europe and say, we'd like a refugee burden sharing scheme. I think the rest of the EU should stay quiet and not remind them about what happened with their opposition of the Visegrad states to the burden sharing scheme for Syrian refugees. I think the EU should bite their hand off and say, yes, we welcome a European-wide burden sharing regime, refugee burden sharing regime. We will share the refugees across Europe. We'll collectively address this issue. And I think now is the time to build this new architecture for this. There will be refugee crises in the future, and it's important, I think, to lock in all of the member states in that now. A broader question, though, is will there be a spillover to other policy issues, to broader institutional developments? I think we will see a more powerful Commission. I think we will see more majoritarian voting and, in general, a more majoritarian, a more federal type polity for security and defense issues. So in that sense, I do think we really are seeing potentially a Riker moment for Europe. However, I will leave you with a thought that Riker did not really address questions relating to democratic accountability. He thought that there would naturally be an evolution towards a democratic polity once federal institutions are set up. I think with the very slow progress of the EU towards addressing the question of the democratic deficit, I think this remains a question that will continue to be unanswered. Thank you very much.
Simon, thank you. For offering your thoughts also on how political science can come to the rescue. And of course, I felt a little bit tempted to comment on the Polish government situation. It's not that difficult to mobilize this government around the geopolitical threat as perceived. But indeed, we need a lot of very smart politics. And the issue of democratic deficit, definitely we need to start to think about it now, not to leave it to later on. Thank you very much, Simon. I will now bring in our roundtable. 4 distinguished scholars in different moments of their scholarly careers, representing different parts of CIVICA Alliance. I will introduce them extremely briefly. I couldn't do justice to their work properly within our format today. And I will introduce them in the order in which they feature on my program. Loïc Azoulay from Sciences Po, Professor of European Law at Sciences Po. And Loïc is also one of the members of CIVICA Thematic Group Europe Revisited that we've mentioned today. Louise Marie Hurel from London School of Economics, a doctoral researcher in data networks and society. Marina Henke from the Hertie School, our host today. Marina is Professor of International Relations and Director of the Center for International Security at Hertie, and Zsolt Enyedi from Central European University. Zsolt is Professor of Political Science. He's also been leading the CIVICA thematic group, Democracy in the 21st Century. Initially, we were supposed to talk about global challenges, and as our first major task to reflect upon. And we've decided that we will stay with this one, only looking from within, changed not only geopolitically, but also, I guess, society in terms of our societal commitments and responsibility perspective. So our first round of reflections will be on that. Our participants will share a few thoughts on the global challenges to Europe as they see it, from their different disciplinary, professional, and perhaps geographical location. And I will start with Loïc.
Thank you very much, Xymena. Delighted to be part of this panel. First of all, what I would like to say is that it's, of course, very difficult to think at this moment in time. The background of war, the noise of war, has a kind of disruptive effect on any kind of thinking. That being said, as a European lawyer and as a European citizen, this aggression is a shock that brings me back to the shadows of the past, what it seems to me that what we experience today is a shift in our consciousness from an existence that has been governed by many concerns, mainly socio-economic concerns, cultural concerns, political concerns, to a new form of existence, a tragic form of existence, where our lives and our forms of life in Europe are threatened. And this, in my view, raises two main challenges. The first challenge, the first global challenge, say, is not so new. It was brought to the fore during the pandemic. Actually, it's just an extension on what we have been experiencing during the pandemic. The pandemic the issue was about saving lives. It was about preserving infrastructures, such as healthcare system, production lines, and so on. Now, today, the issue is about, of course, the protection of lives of Ukrainians. But from the point of view of Europeans, the issue is the defense of the protection of core values, of foundational values of Europeans and ways of living in Europe. And in both crises, the pandemic crisis and this new event, this new crisis, what we see is that this exposes us to, and this is the first challenge, our dependency towards countries such as Russia, such as China, that we consider to be as rivals. For China, I mean, we label it a systemic rival, or even enemy in the case of Russia. And so, what in my view has become clear is that we live in a context of interdependence. But interdependence is not just a matter of increasing cross-border transaction or opportunity for social relationship or political relationship. We find out that interdependence can be, so to say, weaponized by external partners or rivals or enemy in pursuance of economic or geopolitical ends. And that, of course, is not new, but that has become real, that we have neighbors, that we have rivals, that we have enemies as Europeans. And which means that, and this is the first challenge, which is a geopolitical, but also a mental challenge, which means that our relative position is determined by geographical as well as historical factors. What we find out, I mean, to put it clearly, is that the past is not gone, and that we are assigned to a certain geographical place, and that this past and this place are disputed. And so we so far as Europeans, we imagine ourselves as being part of a kind of virtually unlimited project, subject only to internal limits, but that can be constantly shifted to export, to extend our model, our norms, and our models. Now we find ourselves limited. That's a geopolitical and a mental challenge. We find ourselves limited. And so the first challenge I would say is how to manage this new state of affairs, how to manage interdependence in this new factual and mental context. And this calls for a new self-understanding of what we are as Europeans. That's the first challenge, I would say. The second challenge, to be short, which is related, as I see it, and I will put it like this, is the following. This war shows that Europe has to be re-empowered financially, legally, militarily, morally, politically, institutionally. But how to, and here is the challenge, how to re-empower Europe while not falling into a new form of Eurocentrism, a new form of productivism, a new form of ordoliberalism that would be conducive to polarization. And this new stance as a geopolitical actor that the EU wants to assume carries risk. And this is the second challenge. And these risks are the following. We are developing a new model reducing our dependencies, developing new capabilities. This, of course, may lead to a re-empowerment of polluting forces and industries. So there is a risk on our commitment to climate change. There is a risk on our commitment to preserve the planet and the earth. New forms of productivism. The other risk is a risk related to the discourse we develop at this moment in time. What I see is that there is a new discourse on the idea of re-empowering Europe. The re-empowerment of Europe goes hand in hand with a new discourse on defending our European way of life. What we oppose to this brute force of Putin is mainly the force of this statement. Our European way of life is not negotiable, is not up to negotiation, is not up to debate. The new president of the European Parliament said on the 1st of March that the Ukrainian resistance shows us that our way of life is worth defending. Now, what I would like to point out is that this kind of language, this kind of rhetorics, may also be conducive to a form of polarization. A polarization between we Europeans and they, the Russian, a kind of external polarization. A polarization between, say, to be brief, two kinds of refugees, the good refugees and the bad refugees. And we see that this unequal treatment of refugees in Europe today. That is very striking. And finally, a polarization between two kinds of model of societies. The European way of life, that is a discourse that is mobilized by people who defend the abstract values of a liberal, open and pluralist society. But at the same time, the European way of life is mobilized by people fighting for law and order, an homogeneous society, a closed society, through abstract references to national identity or the European civilization. So here is a danger, here is a risk. And the last risk, I would say, is that this new stance of Europe as a geopolitical actors leads to new investments on capabilities, infrastructures, energy infrastructure, financial, technological, communication infrastructure, vital infrastructure, massive investments. This may generate, this will of course increase our interdependence within Europe, but at the same time, this may generate an increased sense of dispossession, an increased sense of distrust towards elites and towards Europe in large groups of people around Europe. So in my view, we have two challenges. One is how to manage interdependence in this context of adversity. And the second one is how to re-empower Europe while not falling into a new form of Eurocentrism. Thank you.
Yes, Loic, thank you so much. Also for keeping us a bit on our toes, namely that it is not so easy and it's not so advisable just to go back to old ways or to remilitarized or to focus entirely on defense or on our kind of unique values. But this occasion should also be an opportunity to think through this way of life without contributing to further polarization. Point well taken, certainly. Louise Irel.
Thank you very much, Xymena. I think it's really nice to go right after Loic because what we've been hearing here is really about the positionality of Europe, right? And I would really like to just touch upon that. And before that, I just a quick anecdotal point. I was having this conversation the other day with a person engaged in policy, and that person came up to me and said, it's almost like we were living in another magic mountain. And right now we're kind of faced with a very different scenario. if we were focused on perhaps different scattered agendas, I think what we see is that a crisis repurposes a lot of the efforts and actions, right? And I when you propose the questions, Xymena, I kept thinking about this relationship between European challenges and global challenges, Europe and global. What's Europe's position in the global, right? And I think it is impossible to not reflect in what has been happening in Ukraine in this context. The war itself has propelled this blurring of boundaries between European and global challenges. It is a movement that I see that is exactly, if I may use, like a globalizing effect of the conflict, right? It's about the narratives that have been echoed. And I would like to just flesh out at least like 4 ways in which I see that how Europe has been kind of propelled into this kind of globalized position, not because it's superior, not because it's positioning itself, but the conflict as this way of just being global in a way, of the effects of it being globalized in a way. So of course, it's inevitable that when we think about global markets, from a market perspective, this globalizing effect of the conflict, which is not necessarily kind of encompassing everything, but definitely the effects here. When we see from a market perspective, the sanctions coupled with the Russian isolationism lead definitely to these cascading challenges around oil prices, right? So it has peaked in the US, it has peaked in other countries in Latin America. There is a whole discussion across Europe around dependency when it comes to gas. And there's a concern also here in the UK as to whether bills will rise, right? And so there is this effect of how a conflict kind of goes in waves and how we see these effects going throughout different places. The second one is kind of this positioning of Europe, which is quite interesting, that Loic already touched upon, right? Is the discursive and ideological point of that. When President Zelensky, for example, says in a very important and timely manner that our war is a war for Europe, is kind of positioning Europe again in this kind of global stage and the conflict as something that is much bigger than a particular place and space and a geographical location, but how it kind of takes on different dimensions, be it from a market perspective, be it from a discursive perspective, but also from migration flows. It's, the refugee crisis, the spread of fleeing people from the war, and of course from information flows, which I think is something that Manon already talked about. So as a person that studies cybersecurity and kind of has been very much in this field, just looking at how almost the crowdsourcing of the battlefield has been happening in the context of the war in Ukraine, with farmer militaries from different countries across the globe actually using social media to share military tactics on how civilians could create barricades across the cities to help them have actually strategies for doing ambushes, and just experiencing and witnessing the conflict through social media in a way that I imagine all of us have been doing for the past couple of weeks. So Russian groups, for example, using crowdsourcing platforms to pay people to actually tell them where specific elements or bombs or what are the contexts or how's the critical infrastructure, like these information, actually using platforms to gather those kinds of informations. And Anonymous, for example, just going out there in Twitter and just saying that it would help the Ukrainians. I think what we've been seeing is basically a global witnessing of this conflict in various different ways, which comes from an outreach of the Ukrainian government, but also from this use of social media that has been so very present. But at the same time, I think we go from this notion of witnessing and convergence that Loic painted very well, which is how Europe and different EU countries have actually been converging around strategies which are very much aligned in terms of militarization, which I think was previously mentioned as well. But also, I mean, we look at this convergence, this confrontation as well, because I think at the same time that there is this spillover effect of the conflict globally, I think there's also this confrontation of the contradictions that Europe itself faces. And one of them, of course, is while there is a convergence in values, at some point there is this confrontation that not all immigrants are the ideal immigrants, that what other conflicts are turned invisible in the context of a conflict in Europe, right? And that confronts us with the reality of our normative commitments in this moment of what is relevant, who's relevant, and who gets access in times of crises. And of course, there is this opportunity for rethinking policies around refugees and immigration overall. But what we've been seeing, of course, also in the UK is a very slow progression in terms of actually getting there. And just to kind of close, because I'm mindful of the time as well, what I've tried to kind of peel the layers here is really going from this witnessing of the conflict in social media, looking at how this creates a kind of political convergence, a moment of crisis as this moment of facing and trying to find common values, which is very useful and very productive. A confrontation of these inconsistencies or perhaps challenges that Europe has, faced throughout the years, but now it's perhaps more visible than previously. And of course, the consequences, which I think, has already been said, but I would just like to re-echo of new forms of potential colonialisms, new ways of thinking, new liberalisms. And I think that is one of the potential consequences that we'll be seeing if we don't look also with a critical eye of what the crisis enables, right? I think it's important to respond at this moment, but I think academia does have a place of thinking, okay, so what the crisis enables also have consequences in the medium and long term. And I think we're still going to see that, but definitely something to keep in mind.
Thank you, Liz. Definitely there has been a lot of narrative mobilization, which I think we have every responsibility to problematize. So thank you for also bringing and portraying this in the digital world. Marina.
I'm a professor of international relations with a focus on security politics. So of course, I cannot help myself but to focus on the security aspects of the current situation and, the challenges that have arisen and as well the failures, frankly, that Europe has committed in the realm of security. So a new era has started, period. There have been warning signals. This is not something that just came out of nowhere. If you analyzed Putin's behavior over the last, 10, 15 years, we saw a brutality, we saw aggression. And frankly, I think a lot of people in all sorts of European entities didn't want to see it, wanted to ignore it, or were so scared to actually confront it, so they preferred not to. But to pretend that these signals didn't exist is just a lie. But overall, of course, Europe wanted so badly that all conflicts could be solved with international law, that normative power, economic power would supersede military power, and also that global governance would be a solution for all problems that existed. And I think, here, the Ukraine crisis reminds us that, to a certain degree, that was just wrong, that was built on wrong assumptions. And that you have actors such as Putin who could not care less about international law, who could not care less about international institutions. And that's just a reality that I think we need to factor in again in what we do when it comes to positioning ourselves as Europeans in the global order. And that doesn't mean that we get rid of, our values and our convictions, but you need to just enlarge our toolbox. And I think here what is absolutely critical is not just now to go on a buying spree or another institution building spree of, setting up a EU military and, buying fighter jets and tanks and Navy ships and so forth. But I think the real tragedy actually of this current situation is that Europe has lost the ability to think strategically and even, has lost the understanding of certain strategic terminology. So let me give you a very concrete example, and that's deterrence. Deterrence is a critical, strategic concept. And in my view, Ukraine was a fundamental deterrence failure. And here Europe is just guilty. It is guilty. So how do we define deterrence in general terms? It's an effort to preserve the status quo by threatening the other side with unacceptable costs if it seeks to alter the current relationship. So, you basically have to say very clearly, don't do X or else we will retaliate. And I think in this sense, Europe, never fully understood what the confrontation with Russia was all about, because it was unable to actually to communicate to Putin, if you cross that line, if you launch an invasion, we will do Y. And, it even goes further. And here I'm looking at, Germany in particular. And just, 10 days before the invasion, we had Chancellor Scholz in an interview with the Washington Post in the United States, refusing to even mention Nord Stream 2. And, when asked by a journalist, what are the potential tools to punish Putin, he was using the term strategic ambiguity. And for me, who's very familiar with this terminology, I was shocked, because in a deterrent scenario in which we were already, fully embedded in early February, you cannot use the term strategic ambiguity. In such a moment, you need to actually put fully on the table to say, if you cross that border, if you use the 150,000 or more troops that are already in this particular moment at the border of Ukraine, you have to signal as Germany, but as Europe, if you cross that border, X, Y, Z will happen. And you cannot say strategic ambiguity, we will tell you when it happens. So for me, this was it kind of, again, brought home that there was just a lack of understanding, lack of knowledge of a basic terminology of what deterrence is actually all about. So in this sense, I think going forward, the big challenge for Europe is to relearn strategic thinking and to, build up a knowledge base on what it actually means to conceive strategy. And that's not just developing wish lists, and that's not just developing new working groups and new institutions. And I think, a very important role in this process actually falls on us, falls on university institutions, because I think a lot of places, including CIVICA institutions, and, strategic thinking and everything that belongs to it actually has fallen by the wayside, and we need to, bring it back on a general curriculum. So I will stop here, and I'm looking forward to more input.
Thank you, Marina. So as you were speaking, I was reminded of Ukrainian security experts who back in 2018 and 19 did present quite elaborate scenarios of how a full-fledged war will indeed break out. And the question is whether Europeans didn't want to listen, indeed, because they were in denial of some sort. They still believed that some sort of quasi-deterrence might work, or we don't want to listen to certain actors. I think we can also strategically going forward could rethink how we forge our partnerships. But indeed, basic vocabularies to be revisited as well. I see we are also starting our conversation about what universities and CIVICA in particular could do, how we could be useful. But before that, Zsolt, I'm turning to you for adding a few thoughts about global challenges to Europe as you see it. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Xymena, for including me. I think I can be shorter because many important issues have been raised already. So let me just make that point first, that the war makes us see things in a different light. But the issues that we struggled with prior to the war did not disappear. So obviously our societies need to develop responses to challenges from climate change to inequality, democratic backsliding, the breakdown of the norms of communication, the lack of accountability of algorithms, and so on. Some of these challenges are quite new, and their novelty attracted a lot of attention. And sometimes we forgot that there are old challenges around as well, like imperialism, nationalism, the rule of strong men. They are still around. Now, when we assess the challenges in the light of the war, we should also remind ourselves that we are always tempted to project our own value commitments, our own research agenda on a conflict like this. So I read already quite a few articles that argued that Russia attacked Ukraine because of neoliberalism, because of racism, because of cultural, religious cleavages in our society, and so on. So basically, everybody was promoting his or her original research agenda, which is understandable and in some instances completely justifiable, but we should be aware of this bias. And I have to remind myself of this because for me, the key issue is democracy, but of course this may be partly because I'm dealing with it. So to me, one of the big lessons is again that international politics and national politics are not separable. That what we see now is in some way an outcome of the deterioration of the conditions in Russia that has been happening for a long time. And again, we knew that, but we see very spectacularly. But when you have a dictatorship, then the rest of the world around that dictatorship is not safe either. Finally, as far as Europe specifically is concerned, I think that the big challenge is proper integration. That is, clearly, there are chunks of Europe that haven't been part of the European community. We need an integration that goes beyond legalistic, formalistic measures, that does not impose a particular model on everybody, but allows a conversation that finally can reach a consensus. And this requires a much more intensive dialogue with the societies on the periphery.
Yes, Joel, thanks so much. I mean, indeed, the question of dictatorship and the question of the politics of expertise that we have been witnessing, what it means to be an expert now on Ukrainian crisis, something we could perhaps pick up on. But definitely, I would link, if I may, your contribution also to Simon's keynote and this caution I think he paused on, namely democratic deficit, because in this way or another, the European project has suffered from it, and we need to get back to it. Thank you again. We decided that our second main question will be that of how we can imagine the role of university, perhaps how we can imagine the role of alliances such as CIVICA in producing useful knowledge. If I may use this slightly theoretical speak, we can think about it differently. But I think that is something that we should definitely focus on. And if I could hear a few thoughts from you on this, from where you kind of work geographically, but also in terms of your discipline, and perhaps if you want to add a few words on what CIVICA can take on. Laik, what do you think we should do?
Yes, of course, Xymena, and I will be very brief, indeed, because this is absolutely an open conversation, indeed. What I think is that our task, to put it very briefly, is to provide an intellectual defense of Europe. And by this, I mean we have to strengthen not only our military defenses, but we have to strengthen our intellectual defenses. And by this, and CIVICA, I mean, is well placed to do that. And what I mean by this is that we have to combat, in a word, polarization. Polarization is to be combated, and polarization, what does it mean, polarization? Polarization means basically three things. It means each way of life has its own truth, and the truths do not communicate. Polarization means facts don't work, do not matter. And polarization means that each group has its own story that is unequivocal, far encompassing, unambivalent, non-ambivalent. And so we have to combat this scientifically, intellectually. And in my view, that means that we have to provide thick descriptions of our forms of life. And this requires a collaboration of many social scientists, lawyers and sociologists and political scientists and anthropologists in order to reintroduce ambivalence in the way we see the world and the way we see our societies. We have to introduce a sense that facts matter, a sense of complexity, and also, and I would conclude with that, combating polarization through intellectual means increasing awareness of the people, but also of the institutions about the condition on which their existence depend. There is, it seems to me today in Europe, a complete disconnection between the way we represent ourselves and our life and the condition on which this existence depends. And so this can be done, I think, through our work and through a combination of our tools and skills as social scientists, as lawyers, and especially in the context of CIVICA. I hope I'm making myself clear.
Yes, Loic, for myself, how I understand is that we are in this extremely challenging position of, on the one hand, having to mobilize, but on the other, not to mobilize to an extent of losing our ability to think. And the ability to think is certainly also about being able to live in ambivalence. And while looking for facts and trying to ascertain facts, not to kind of degenerate into this idea that we have the truth. And part of this journey should certainly be, I believe, kind of filling in the buzzwords that we've been throwing around for decades, including diversity, or maybe diversity being one of the main ones, like really filling them with substance, also at the societal level. Thank you very much. Louise?
Thank you very much, Xymena. We had already this conversation in other places, Xymena, but as a person that has been, as I said, working in cybersecurity more specifically and trying to understand both the technological elements of what we've been witnessing, but also kind of the societal and cultural intrinsicies of it all, it's quite interesting because I think scholars working specifically in fields such as this one have been confronted with precisely what can we say during a crisis, right? The cyber Pearl Harbor, the next big cyber attack, has always been in the headlines. But once we're faced with a war, I guess there is a space of reflection and self-reflection on all these promises of a big kind of escalatory cyber war happening and it not happening. I know there's some people that disagree, but what we've been seeing is that when people actually start dying in the fields and that there is an aggressive military invasion in the way it was, then subjects such as the next cyber war become very, very small aside from that, and becomes much more about the tactics rather than necessarily the cyber doom that at least many of us have been hearing in the headlines for the past couple of years. And that brings me to Zolt's point, right, of this also being a moment of thinking about how we read the moment that we're living in. And of course, as I said, this has been a great moment for people working in this field to just reflect on how much we want to read a bigger crisis, or we read, let's say, the next cyber war in a place that it's not happening, right? And I think it also brings back the discussion of accountability in academia in this moment, of also reflecting on the incentives for reading things from the lens and our normative commitments in the way we want to. Because I think, of course, social media pays off very nicely if you're constantly feeding a particular narrative, right? And I think as scholars, and as a young scholar myself trying to also finish my PhD, I think one thing that would be very useful to step back and reflect is precisely on these incentive structures and on what kind of knowledge we're producing from which standpoint, right? So yes, just wanted to bring that point. We can discuss more.
Yes, thank you. I was just thinking that perhaps some sort of cyber war has happened, but not the one that we kind of were so invested in predicting. So we did not quite notice other phenomena. I would just like to remind our audience that we would welcome your questions as well. Marina, what would be your take on the role of, I guess, our profession?
I think we have an absolutely critical role to play. And I think, we haven't even started. Because in all our countries, our foreign policy is built on so many untested assumptions. And I'm, again, giving you an example from the German context. Change through trade. I'm sure you've heard that concept. Germans are convinced by it. In German, all the German speakers here, Wandel durch Handel. But, it is an assumption that, truth to be told, scientifically has not been properly tested, right? And I would love to, for example, organize a conference with all the CIVICA institutions, looking at this scientifically, bringing data, and then let's see what actually comes out of it. Maybe they're absolutely right. And we have a lot of instances in history where trade, led to changes in government institutions. And then, of course, we need to understand under what kind of conditions, what were the causal mechanisms, or maybe not. But this is like a perfect example where I think, past dependence, philosophy, personal convictions, ideology led to a conviction in a very significant segment of the German elite. But it was never really, properly scientifically probed. Let me just take an example from the French context. There's a conviction that nuclear weapons enhance the power of France. Has this been truly tested? I think exactly. It's a philosophical, political, past-dependent concept, and a lot of people adhere to this idea. But I do not know of a serious scientific study that actually tries to probe this assumption. And I think this is where we need to come in, because we have seen that if those assumptions just, are allowed to grow freely, they can cause a lot of harm. And I don't even, this is just like a tiny beginning. There's so many other assumptions out there that have not been properly tested, but they're very, very powerful. And I think we as academics need to reach out and do also a better job picking up those assumptions and bringing them back to academia. So maybe, all our research puzzles and, what we should kind of inspire and encourage our PhD students and postdocs to do is find those assumptions and work on those, have policy questions inspire our research projects and not so much, kind of methodological interest or something else. And I think this is our responsibility.
Which, if I may, I also read as a call for perhaps being less invested in scholastic issues, in the sense that a lot of hypotheses, they have been as if tested, but on the kind of data that is what one may say a little bit strange from reality. So I would add from myself, if I may, that it's definitely important to get to these thick descriptions, as Loic said. So significant empirically data. Zsolt, will you close with your thoughts this round?
Yes, continuing a bit the chain of thought started by Luis about the accountability of academics. So when we reflect on the political role of academics, we should the first rule should be to acknowledge that we have one, that we engage in politics, and this is how it should be. But it's also the case that we care typically more about our moral motives, the moral righteousness of our interventions, and not always enough about the consequences. And this current situation has reminded me of this, because what is happening now is that the United States is moving closer to Venezuela, to Saudi Arabia, in some sense to China. The rule of law procedures against the Polish government and the Hungarian government will be postponed. All developments that look extremely bad to me, but they have to happen because there is something more urgent to do. Politics is about priorities, and this is very trivial in a sense, but we often forget that it is, especially when we, what I do myself often when I make some strong political statement. Now, the question as far as universities is concerned, I think it's quite simple in the sense that universities have a very important role and they can fulfill a very important function in this situation. Actually, what I witnessed at my own university at CU impressed me, because the university was very fast at reacting, not only with charity, but also with coming up with new research fellowship schemes available for Ukrainian and Russian scholars who have to leave their country. And it's important that not only people who leave Ukraine, but also those who have to leave Russia, which is not, which is a very dangerous place now for critical social sciences. So I think this kind of gestures can be expected from other universities around the world as well. And CIVICA is very well placed because we have many colleagues who are anyway working on various aspects of these issues. We can pull together our knowledge of different contexts. We can invite colleagues from the region, and in that sense, we can make sense of the situation, and maybe possibly to have a kind of discussion, a kind of debate that is no longer possible in media or in politics because of the way how politics and media have changed. Academia is still a place where arguments matter and where the discussions are open-ended. And we should exploit this very fortunate condition and make the best of it.
CIVICA, but also CEU, I think, because we have so many students from this part of Europe or basically sharing many identities from this part of Europe within their personalities. And this kind of brings me to underscore something that we've been quite clear, even if not explicit about, that we also need to, and we do, make the difference and draw a distinction between the Putin's government and Russia as a nation. So it's kind of indeed very important as we make space for scholars from the region to remember also about those that are persecuted for academic, well, there's no academic freedom at the moment in the framework that the current Russian government put in place, but that we make, as a CIVICA, we make space for these conversations, which are, as Loic also said, which require ambivalence, perhaps not strategic ambivalence, of course, as a concept, but the ability to somehow endure very different views and explore them. I would like to perhaps look at the Q&A and start with the first question, which I think maybe Louise is the most equipped to deal with. And the question is, that's from Professor Bryson, if I pronounce correctly, from Hertie. At Hertie last night, we heard the suggestion that not enough nations are exercising their right to self-defense, given the assault on Ukraine. Is anyone discussing understanding NATO as already being subject to aggression in the cybersphere, given not only conventional cyber attacks, but the election interference, or is it entirely unhelpful to discuss cyber and information assaults on our security as aggression?
Thanks so much for the question. That is definitely a very tricky question, in the sense that now, if we read this from international law perspective, right? One thing that we might say is definitely that what has been happening in certain instances in cyberspace does not pass the threshold of armed conflict, right? It does not qualify. So it goes back to the basic problem of not necessarily knowing or perhaps revealing the red lines of states not necessarily signaling that. And of course, in that sense, maintaining that, let's say, strategic ambiguity in cyberspace as a way of conducting their own cyber operations. And of course, I think it is a process that has been building up throughout the years. States have been a little bit more clear as to how they see the applicability, let's say, of international law in cyberspace, which provides some kind of indicator as to when a cyber attack is considered an act of aggression, for example, or when it's actually when we go from a perpetual unpeace, let's say, to a context of war. But what we've seen so far is that there is this challenge, right? And I think partly the answer to the question is, I'd say that states are still wrapping their minds around what that means in cyberspace, right? I think there is a growing discussion in international processes as to whether, election interference should be considered or not. And definitely, the context of the war in Ukraine, we might read it from a perspective that we have been in cyber war for many years, and this is just yet another kind of snapshot, or that cyber war never kind of existed, and that we're basically seeing that the promise of actually having that in cyberspace is not fulfilling itself. It's just a part of the strategic and tactical kind of operations that states might want to use either before engaging in armed conflict or during an armed conflict. But that definitely, from a country that has been engaging in cyber operations for so many years, I think it's kind of surprising for at least the cybersecurity kind of community of experts, let's say. But I'd leave it at that because I could definitely keep talking about this endlessly.
There's one more question which I would like maybe even a brief reaction from you on, namely the cyberspace as a battle of narratives. And there is a question from Vincent, if I pronounce correctly. And the core of the question, as I interpret it, is that the digital world is actually not as globalized in the sense of being open to many participants, but it's actually distributed among, let's say, powerful actors. Do you have an opinion on that? That actually it's quite difficult, let's say, to arrive at this position of informed ambivalence because the extent to which the digital has already been kind of, the land has been allocated, even if there is no land there.
I'm not sure I fully grasped your question, Xymena, but I would definitely say that I think there is definitely, this idea that what we have, like in terms of internet, in terms of our digital infrastructure, that it should be secure and open. But what we see is that there is a very precondition of not knowing what's happening whenever we talked about cyber operations or whatnot. I think it's a place of what there's fog, and I think in the context of where there's even greater fog that comes with that. And I think just going back to the point of researchers in this context, I think for us that are researching this, it's even harder to kind of wrap our minds around the lay of the land, let's say, who's engaging in what, and whether, when will, let's say, Article 5 of NATO will be activated because of a cyber attack, let's say. It's very tricky to discuss that. And also in terms of the information, or let's say the data that you would need also to kind of think about these things in practice. But I'm not sure if I responded to your question, but we can definitely.
I think for me, it is also very much about this battle of narratives that Manon was talking about, that we are actually in a relatively limited numbers of these narratives. There are several other questions. We won't be able to address them all. But if you allow me, Marina, there is a question from Marek Janicki on the chat, to which perhaps you could contribute. And the question is about the fact that in a very short period of time, many countries have changed, if not reversed, their defense positions, with Germany's decision to send military equipment to Ukraine, Finland and Sweden, floating towards the NATO, also Poland. A decision to welcome refugees, which is indeed, it can be contested whether it was done for, let's say, humanitarian or geopolitical reasons, if I may be so cynical. But basically, the question would be for an international security defense scholar: do you think that these changes are here to stay?
I think so. I'm based in Berlin, as you know, and so I follow the German discussion very closely. And we were all very surprised by the German government's decision now, almost 2 weeks ago. But, maybe it's a little interesting for you to understand what actually happened in the background, because it was until that Sunday morning, nobody really knew about that this would happen. And it, 100 billion euros and, the 2%, these are huge decisions for Germany. And also like the F-35, the fighter jet decision that was just announced. But, I think there were two different factors. The first factor was that, and I, alluded to this before, you had very significant, powerful segments of the German elite believing until Wednesday morning that this would never happen. Meaning, you can deal with Putin, trade leads to change. In the big picture of things, we can have friendly, cordial relations, and what the Baltic states say and what the Poles say, they exaggerate. They live in some kind of mystic, belligerent world, and we know better. And then on that morning, they, woke up to a different reality, and they had to admit to themselves that they were wrong. And so, I think there was a partial attempt to compensate for the mistakes. But, and I think this is a crucial but, on that Friday, there was a NATO briefing, and Jens Stoltenberg briefed the heads of governments at the highest level of the NATO leaders. And on that Friday, it was still a little difficult to assess the Ukrainian resistance. And so Stoltenberg said there is a likelihood, and it's not zero, that Russia actually moves further. If this is really the walk in the park that they were anticipating, the Russians, right? So they could just move very easily toward Kiev, conquer the city, and then, they had already 180,000 troops assembled. There was a real probability that they would go further and, toward Moldova. And of course, in this moment, there was shock and there was fear. And so I think the combination of fear and guilt is something that was really propelling the German elites forward. And I think especially the fear component, especially in Germany, where the Bundeswehr is really pretty weak as an institution, I think it changed dramatically the concept. And I'm not so familiar with the domestic context of the countries that were mentioned, but Germany as a big country, might actually be one of the leaders of this movement, and if they kind of like stick to the decisions, it's likely as well that others will join and will stick as well to their announcement. I want to add a very quick word to the NATO question and the cyber war, because I think it's quite relevant. So we have to be worried about escalation. And so if NATO now declared a cyber attack as falling under Article 5, that means we need to, we NATO countries need to retaliate. You cannot just declare a violation of Article 5 and then say, well, we're not going to do anything about it. And then, of course, if NATO then responds, we need to expect that Russia is responding, and boom, we are in a fully fledged war. And so I think there is on purpose a lot of intentional restraint on the side of NATO leaders just to keep that under lid, because we really don't want to enter these escalation scenarios.
Yes, thank you for that. And of course, there is the nuclear weapon is always in the background. Some have mentioned that they hope that since the Putin's army has been so incompetent so far, perhaps the nuclear option is actually not working anymore either. But it is obviously a weak consolation. There is. I will put together a few questions, if you don't mind, and ask Loïc and Zsolt. And I'm putting together a couple of questions into a following. Do you think there is, in terms of the difference between the democratic and authoritarian, autocratic, or even totalitarian at this point narratives in the public domain, including internet, of course? Do you think that, can we think of any policies or any kind of practices or even ideas that would help strengthen the democratic narrative? Or do you think we are already strong enough? Or actually the democratic narrative is at the moment, what is it losing? Or is it actually being mobilized? So the question basically is, what is this balance between the democratic and authoritarian narrative as you see it at the moment? And what it would take to perhaps strengthen the democratic one going forward. Can I start with Zsolt?
As far as I can see globally, the democratic narrative got a boost now, and the unity that has crystallized around opposition against Russian aggression has also strengthened a commitment to liberal democracy in general. You see a number of authoritarian politicians in the West being extremely embarrassed about their Putinism, or at least about the overlap of their rhetoric and Putin's rhetoric. There are exceptions. I just listened to Viktor Orban's speech on Hungary's national holiday, the 15th of March national holiday. And he had a different interpretation. He argued that there is no moral difference between Russia, Ukraine, and United States. Everybody's looking after his or her interests. And rational politicians in the region stay out of this conflict. But instead, they focus on the fight against gender politics that comes from the West to undermine our society. So you do have that discourse, and to some extent, it depends on how the conflict ends and how international actors react to the conflict itself, whether the Orbanist rhetoric or the liberal democratic one will be strengthened. But to the extent I can see, we are almost in a a Second World War moment, which at the cost of the millions and millions of lives, did make the world a more democratic place, because it made people understand what are the stakes, and in at a different level. But this is what I see happening now.
Thank you. I haven't listened to that speech yet, but I understand certain tropes are being repeated. Loïc, would you mind closing our roundtable with your thoughts now?
But that's a very difficult question to me. My sense is that these two narratives, the democratic one and the authoritarian one, feed each other at the moment, at the global level and within the European Union. They feed each other. Can I say this in English? Yes. No? They feed each other. Also because the first point is that this is internal to Europe. It's not just external, as we have just heard. We have this tension and this division of narratives internal to Europe. And what I'm struck by the fact that in many cases, the democratic narrative relies on elements that are common to the authoritarian narratives, namely identity, the identity fiction, the national fiction, the nation, the abstract values disconnected from the everyday life of people. So I see it as a very intricate state of affair where they feed each other. So we have to deactivate in Europe the element that may feed this cross-fertilization of the democratic and the authoritarian narratives. I mean, take the case of the migrants. I've seen that there is a question about migration. No? It's a very striking example, isn't it? The case that we have at the same time in Europe this wonderful support to Ukrainians. It's very impressive in Poland, for instance. Free access, support, protection of rights, access to education, free movement of Ukrainians all over Europe. This is not even allowed to European citizens due to COVID. So what we have is, on the one hand, we have I would say a demographic enlargement of Europe, where Ukrainians are kind of virtual citizens of the European Union. But at the same time, on the other hand, on the same territory, close to the border between Ukraine and Poland, in Belarusia, the border between Belarusia and Poland, close to it. At the same time, we have migrants being mistreated, being placed in indecent conditions, not the same group of migrants. And so I'm very struck by this contrast. And the way I see it is that, and it's very striking to me, we have to deeply reflect on the current situations. And so to connect to your questions, how I see the division between what they have in common, all these things, is the protection of the European way of life. Meaning, we have to be very clear on what we mean, what we protect exactly. If we say, and there is an ambivalence and ambiguity here, if we say that we protect migrants for humanitarian reasons because they are part of the human community, then we may make progress, I guess. But if we say, as I hear today in some parts of Europe, that we protect the Ukrainians because they look like us, because they are similar to us, they are perceived as being similar to us, then we rely on a cultural agreement that will feed the authoritarian narrative, while we seem to be democratic in doing the same thing. You see what I mean? So here again, I plead to go very deep in the tension that characterizes our current condition and try to unravel all the dilemmas and tensions and ambiguities that we live in.
Loic, I couldn't wish for a better wrap up, because it leaves us in a normative discomfort that I think is absolutely necessary for us to revisit these conversations about the role of Europe and European university. And as unsettling perhaps, but I would like to leave us with this picture of the European Union's eastern border. Think about the section bordering Belarus, where indeed not only is it a geopolitical border with another dictatorship, but it is also a border that stalls migrants that are not white. And then there is the section with the Ukraine, which is a non-border, where we indeed welcome Ukrainian refugees. And I think this picture could very well feed, if I may, into quite a lot of discussion going forward. I would like to thank everyone. It's been a long but extremely rewarding encounter. And I thank our participants. I thank our audience. I thank very much Irina Stella at Hertie and the whole group that have been supporting me through the organization supporting CIVICA. I wish everyone a good evening, but keeping in this slight normative discomfort as we rethink our ways. Thank you very much. Good evening.